The last time we went through Psalm 46, and if you were to just briefly summarize, 146, sorry. If you were to just briefly summarize why we don't want to ever put our trust in human helpers, there's kind of two main reasons that Psalm 46 lays out. Well, three. Should be written down in your book, on your sheets. But if your Bibles are open, you can also still look for it. You do have a reason for not having yours written down. Do you want my Psalm? I'm dropping batteries. So what do we know about human helpers?
Fallible.
They're fallible. And related to that,
Sinners.
what's that?
Sinners.
So they're sinners. They die. Remember the octopus? Why can't octopi take over the world? They only live 3 years. Really, our lives are not that much longer. So no matter how good a king or ruler, their lives will end. And then, as King Solomon said, who knows if the man after me will be wise or a fool? Poor Rehoboam reading those words. And then finally, ultimately,
They cannot save.
they cannot save. And in contrast to that, Psalm 146 says to look to the Lord because his justice and his reign last forever. And so he is the ruler. He is everything that our rulers are not. And then we simply recognize also that that doesn't mean that God doesn't use people and even government to accomplish some of the things that it lists there in Psalm 146. To obtain justice, to give food, to release prisoners, for healing, to watch over the foreigners, and sustain the fatherless and the widow, that we should rejoice whenever we get a chance to be a part of God's care for his creation. And we should also rejoice whenever our rulers have those priorities in mind as well. Any thoughts or questions on our briefest summary from last week? I'd like to get through this whole lesson today, because I want to get through a whole lesson next week and a whole lesson the week after, so that by election day we're done with this study. So I don't care how long, how much you want to talk or how much I want to talk. We're going to keep moving. No. We're going to be disciplined.
Ooh.
And I have a catechism class to teach after church. So, question 5 on page 11 in your study. The state which God has instituted has a dual personality. The state does good work when it protects and provides for its citizens. But the state is an ally of Satan when it works to destroy the faith of God's people. How do the following passages describe the state as an agent of God or an agent of evil? So, Joel and Norm, even though you're on opposite sides of the table, why don't you look up Acts 22, 22 through 29. And Susan and Ben, you can look up Philippians 1, verses 12 through 18. Rich and Linda can look up Luke 2, 1 through 7. You get one of the easy ones. And Jean and Sheila can look up Matthew 2, 13 through 18. Kate, so if you can look up Ezra 1, and I will look up Daniel 3. And all of these are in contrast to each other. That's your hint. So if you're not quite sure, and the people in front of you have something good to say about the state or something bad to say about the state, you can have a pretty good hunch that we're going to have the opposite. Not really. Ezra's building the temple. You go. Ezra's there before Nehemiah, but then also at the same time. Wait a minute. You want to discuss your answer with your partner, although Norman and Joel are going to have a harder time. And Joel. I can bring time. All right, so what's happening in Acts 22? Okay.
Well, he doesn't get flogged.
Well, he doesn't get flogged.
Because
Why doesn't he get
Because of the
flogged?
state.
Okay. He says what?
I'm a Roman citizen.
I'm a Roman citizen. And everyone drops everything because they have to treat a Roman citizen properly. It says something about the Roman Empire, I suppose. But at least if you were a citizen, you had rights, and you could require the government to uphold its responsibility for your rights. Ben and Susan?
It seems kind of positive, but, I'm in chains, but the government may have intended that for one thing, but God is using it for another.
So Paul recognizes, had he done anything wrong? And yet he had been locked up anyways. And so the government seemed to be doing Satan's work, but at the same time, Paul recognized God's at work here. And he often talked about how many people were hearing the gospel because the Romans paid for his trip to Rome. There were a few shipwrecks and problems along the way, but eventually he got there, and then he was put on house arrest, and even the house of Caesar was hearing the word of God through Paul. All right, I don't remember to whom I assigned each one. You guys are Luke 2.
Yeah,
I think that's familiar to all of us.
right. The census that was required by Caesar Augustus, and so Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem. That's where Jesus was born.
Do you think Caesar was studying Micah chapter 5 before he issued that census?
Probably not.
Probably not. And yet, through the and a census is a fine thing for a government to do, to try to figure out who's in my empire and what needs they have and where they're all from. That's all good government stuff. Caesar Augustus was nothing if not an efficient organizer. But in that, God's will is done. Gene and Sheila? So Herod's got an evil decree, and who's the devil aiming at? Or at whom is the devil aiming when Herod issues that decree? He's aiming at God's own son. So you can see how the devil would want to inflame Herod's worst paranoias so that the Messiah would be killed before he could do any of his work. And yet, how does God use that? For good. So, yes, so first of all, like, there is the prophecy about the weeping that would come, that would accompany the Messiah in this sinful world, but also that Jesus is then fully pictured in God calling his children out of Egypt and out of slavery. And so it shines the light on Jesus as Messiah, and also shows that God is not dominated by the evil of this world. Ezra 1.
Cyrus, knows how great he is. God has told him to build a temple or build a house for him in Jerusalem, so he can build
Okay.
it back and bring in the people.
And in that one, I think it's cool. Cyrus does know that he's been prophesied about. The exiles take the book of Isaiah to Cyrus and say, hey, you see this name in here? Isn't that your name? And Cyrus goes, why, yes it is. And so he's more than happy to fulfill prophecy. Yes, I have been foretold by God. It's nice of you to notice how important I am. And then on the flip side, these are backwards historically. Kind of bothers me that I'm reading. I should have gone through this. Nebuchadnezzar builds a giant golden statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. Trying to picture the proportions of that. It seems very skinny. 90 feet by 9. Kind of like a totem pole almost.
3
Anyway.
stories high.
He builds this giant golden statue, and he says, you're all going to bow down and worship the statue at the playing of the music. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, no, we're not. And so one of those events, it would be interesting to see how it occurred. Because it seems like somebody had to go tattle on them what they weren't doing. But in my mind, I want to picture like the whole crowd of people bowing down, and then just them standing there going, their hands crossed behind their back. That's how I want to picture it, but I don't know if it's that. And he does it again, and then he does it a third time. He commands them, and the third time they say, the God we serve can save us. And I love this, they say, but even if he doesn't, we want you to know that there's no way we're going to bow down to your stupid statue. They didn't say stupid statue. They were actually probably very respectful people. And he has the furnace heated up 5 times hotter, and the people die just dropping them into it. And the result is Nebuchadnezzar reverses his order and declares that for the next month everyone's going to worship the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Obviously that doesn't stick. In a pagan culture you are free to worship as many gods as you want, so adding the Lord to their pantheon is not necessarily a good evil. faith, but to recognize God's power, His glory was something. So, how was God's agenda, that is, his desire to save us, evident when the governments persecuted the church? And then give examples. Okay? So when persecution arose in Jerusalem in the early church, they spread out and they took the gospel everywhere with them. Other examples. Good morning, Shauna.
Good morning, how are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you? Okay. There you go. How about before the resurrection? What did the chief priest say at the beginning of Holy Week? He says it is better for one man to die than for the whole nation to be lost. And so they plot, they bribe Judas, and they bully Pilate. And Pilate is weak and ineffectual, and they crucify Christ, and our salvation is accomplished. Of the chief priests, no, it does not seem like they did. Of the Pharisees, it seems like occasionally, yes. Like St. Paul, when he's about to be attacked, right before he appeals to Caesar in that same section, he cries out in Hebrew, "It's because I believe in the resurrection that I'm being persecuted." Because the Sadducees, who were the ruling council in Jerusalem, denied that there was a resurrection, saying that the flesh is evil, and so once you die, that's it. And so Paul appeals to the Pharisees and his belief in the resurrection to come to his defense. What about when Rome was throwing people in the Colosseum? The Romans were very moved by the Christians' bravery and steadfastness in the face of death. You wander into places we could tread softly. Because God does not ever, I shouldn't say ever, because he does harden Pharaoh's heart. God does not force us to make our decisions. So, whatever decisions. So, God does not force Adolf Hitler to invade Poland and Belgium and France. And yet I can still say that God used that event according to his book. In the same way, God does not force people to do what is right. But he may be working in their hearts to do that. But that God can, in his sovereignty and in his foreknowledge, give us, to some degree, the freedom of choice in our earthly affairs, and still use that to accomplish his eternal plans and the plan he has for your individual life is a mystery we will not know. So God, you're right, God does know who's going to win the election, and he also knows the result. But God does not cause anybody to cast their vote one way or the other. And he does not cause one side to choose this type of legislation or policy, or that side to choose that legislation or policy. And so we can trust his control even as we advocate for better decision making. And as I said, sometimes God's will is judgment. And so our decisions matter. Can you think of examples of God using government in semi-recent history? I'll allow it. Elaborate.
He was trying to be persecuted by the church.
He was willing to be persecuted, but yes.
I mean, he was, but wasn't the government also part of the Roman Catholic Church?
They were very much intertwined. And I think it would be fair to say Charles V considered himself not just like under the thumb of Rome or beholden to Rome, but he considered himself a good Roman Catholic. And so he wanted to do what the church said was right. It's not quite where I thought you were going to go. But I suppose along those lines, Luther's declared an outlaw, and he's put away in hiding in the Wartburg Castle. What does he do while he's there? He translates the Bible into German and thus changes Christianity forever, no matter how the Reformation would have turned out. Even Roman Catholics today read their Bibles in English. I have a whole box full of them from a devout Roman Catholic that I need to go through and see if her notes are in them or if they just need to be respectfully disposed of, because I don't need a whole box full of full random translations of the Bible. So, absolutely. It's certain. So, we didn't mention when we talked about ancient history, the Roman roads and the Roman peace, that you could travel from one side of the empire to the other in relative safety, not absolute safety, but in relative safety and relatively easily without having to show your passport at every border. That's certainly made it so that Christianity could be taken everywhere. Along the same lines of what Joel is saying, not only was the Bible translated because Luther was declared an outlaw, but at every step of the way, when Charles demanded an answer from the Lutherans for what they believed, and when the church told lies about the Lutherans and what they were believing, they weren't called Lutherans, but that is where our Lutheran confessions come from. You don't have the Augsburg Confession if the Lutherans aren't being declared heretics and threatened. You don't have the Formula of Concord if the Lutherans aren't trying to figure out how they are going to be faithful to God's Word and unite in opposition to an empire that wants to kill them. I can go one other direction in the Reformation time. The Turks. Charles V can't devote his attention to the Lutheran problem until it's way too late to stop them from believing that blasted monks' teachings, because he's got a war on one of his borders and he needs the German armies. The Germans were fighters. All the way back to Roman times, they were somewhat pugnacious, so to speak. And sometimes that was to the emperor's advantage. They were needed. We think more modern than that.
Roe versus Wade.
So it's funny, this study is written in 2019. So I think we would say Dobbs now. Because Dobbs is the current precedent. But the decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. That's more of a justice thing than a church thing, but I think it's worth mentioning. When was the last time the government asked to see what I'm teaching? It's not a trick question, I promise. When was the last time I had to file my report with the government to show that I was teaching what they approved? The government can do that. And I'm still not sure what happened there. That was the early days of everybody live streaming. It's also possible that it was an innocent glitch. It just so happened that it cut off at a certain point when I was saying something that wasn't approved by what we might call the powers that be. But I can't prove that. I never received any note on it. The government has never asked for my report on what I teach. I think we can say that that's been fairly good, that we have the freedom to practice our religion. By the way, don't let people say freedom of worship. Yes, we have freedom to worship, but that is a much narrower right than the freedom of religion, which is to put your religion into practice. Do not let them limit your faith to this building. You should correct somebody who says we have freedom to worship. We have freedom of religion. We get to practice our religion, or you have to change the Constitution. It's okay to be the Apostle Paul a little bit and say, that's what the law says. I'm a U.S. citizen. I get to practice my religion, not just worship in whatever way I desire. The example in here is Vietnam gave the Wells personal permission to build a seminary. And whether or not down the road they're going to try to get their own benefit out of it, they saw. And one of the reasons why they picked the Wells is because the Wells tends to be apolitical. We have a record of telling people to support the government in the country that they're in. So they figured we are going to try to overthrow their government. And so if all these darn Christians are going to be here anyways, we might as well get them trained by people who are at least not going to sow dissension among the people.
So that's quite different than China and how they deal with it, you think?
Yes. In fact, kind of be careful when you post things on the internet. They want us to be careful how we speak about what's happening in China. And it's fine that you mentioned it, but yes. And yet, we can see how certain desires within that nation also give opportunities for us to send people there to preach the gospel, because they gain some benefit from us and what we can bring them, and so they are able to, or willing to, maybe overlook some of the other works because they still see an advantage to having our people in the country. That's all the further that means. Not that my Bible studies can be search far and wide, but search techniques, who knows? It's proper to be fair. I still have 12 minutes. Oh no, that clock is not right. If we assume my watch is correct. So now I really do have to move. So Acts 4, verses 16 through 20. So I'm going to summarize that while you... Peter and John are told to stop preaching. And they get locked up. And then an angel sets them free and says, don't sit around here in prison. Go to the temple and start talking about Jesus. And so they go to the temple and start talking about Jesus. And the ruling council goes to the prison and opens the door looking for Peter and John, and they go, "The doors are locked." They're like looking around, they under the bed, they're not there. And while they're still standing there scratching around, someone comes and says, "Yeah, those men you're looking for, they're in the temple preaching the good news of Jesus Christ." And they say, "How did that happen?" They round them back up and they said, "We just told you yesterday, don't talk about Jesus." And they say the oft-quoted line, "We must obey God rather than men." So, what is the standard for where government's power over your actions ends? Where it disagrees with what God tells us. So here are a few discussion points, and we'll see how many we get through. In your role as a public school teacher, you're required to teach evolution. That's mild nowadays. Can you do this, or should you refuse?
So I had one that was a Christian, and he always made it evident the theory of. He always put the theory of every time evolution came up. And
Right, to present this is what evolution teaches. That's how I think, because even Christians should have some awareness of what evolution teaches. I do wonder if we should be a little bit more, push back a little to say, if we can say this is what evolution, not to say that we should be teaching a 6-day creation, but simply that for much of history, people have always believed that this creation is designed, and here is some of the evidence for design as well. That we could simply leave it at that and say, you can see both sides of these things, and science does not require evolution. Except there are thousands upon thousands. That's a whole nother thing. But just to simply say, this is the prevailing scientific explanation for the origins of the universe. And so to say evolution teaches.
Maybe looking at paradigms and this is constantly changing. The only absolute is that it's going to continue to change.
change.
Correct. That's the history of science explanation. Think about all the things that we think are ridiculous, that people were convinced that this is how it was in the past.
The road is
Some
silent.
of these things will be looked on with that same,
And
that's
we will-
ridiculous.
Right. And in general, the goal of science is that it helps you figure out how things work in the present. That's the goal of science.
So would it be wrong for a minister to instead of saying creating, to do what will is normally out there at this time? Call it intelligent.
That's how I would probably phrase that. That there is, while some look at similarities and say that's evidence of mutation, others see similarities and say common design. And just leave it at that to say, when it comes to these things, what is testable and what is duplicatable, that's what really matters in science. And while evolution does have some explanatory benefits, I don't think they're refuted by creation.
Because we know in this day and age that if you're a teacher, you gotta say that I believe God. Explain the faith that you will most likely talk to about.
So, now we are going to get to things. On one hand, the teacher's beliefs as they separate from what is necessary for children to know to function in our society and to be formed as human beings, as the teacher has been placed there for this purpose. The teacher's beliefs, especially where they are opposed to the parental beliefs, really do not belong in the classroom. The teacher is there with a trust from the parents. And that is how Christians should view the vocation of teacher. That you are entrusted by the parents with the education of this child. And so you should be striving to support the parental goals for that child, for the child's own good. There may be times when there are things that you would disagree with the parents and you would say are not for that child's good, that you might not be able to go along with. On the flip side, from stories that I've read, things that I've seen, and eyewitness testimonies that I have from our own school district here, I think it's fair to say that teachers are preaching a false religion when it comes to sexuality. And a Christian should have every right to demand that they not impose this false religion of sexuality on their children. And that if they do, they should be removed, because it is not for the good of the child and it's breaking the trust. And whether that means that the Christian should find alternative methods of education, or to start going to school board meetings and going over every piece of curriculum with a fine-tooth comb. Those are kind of the options that Christians are left with. And I say this carefully because I don't think a Christian teacher should be saying, well, I'm a creationist, and this is all the reasons why I believe in the sixth-day creation. That breaks the trust of what the parents are sending their children to be taught. If I'm willing to say that, well, then I also have to be willing, I should be able to then stand up and say, this gender ideology is breaking the trust of what most parents are willing to have their children be taught. And especially in the lower grades, but even in at the high school level. Especially since it is clearly anti-truth. Not just a statement of faith, but disprovable on every level. And furthermore damaging to children. And Oregon's going to be the last to come to that conclusion, but slowly but surely, school districts around the country are starting to go, we're allowing what to be taught here now? Because parents are paying closer attention. So that's where we have to end. And I want to talk about wedding cakes. I'm gonna have to go through and see what we can do to make it so that we can be mostly done by the election time. Maybe I'll skip ahead and then come back and we can discuss the intermediate application things. And we can-
The election.
Either way, I'm pretty sure that I'm going to want to say something before the election, so next week and the week after. And then, yes, if we need to go back, we can certainly do that. So I'm going to look it over. Mike, if you can hear me, you can switch off our live screen. I don't have